Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for a discussion of scenarios for post-Putin Russia. My name is Jennifer Wistran, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute. Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to remind you that you can stay up to date on Kennan Institute activities by visiting our website and subscribing to our blogs, podcasts, and other publications. So today's guests, we have Sergei Alexishenko, Denis Bulunov, Vladislav Inozemtsev, and Yuri Terechov. Sergei Alexishenko is a member of the Anti-War Committee of Russia. He's an economist who was an official at the Russian Ministry of Finance from 1995 until 1998. He also served on the board of the Central Bank of Russia. Denis Bulunov is a member of the Russian Anti-War Committee in Prague and a researcher in the Faculty of Social Sciences at Charles University in Prague. Vladislav Inozemtsev is a special advisor at the Middle East Media Research Institute in Washington, D.C. And finally, Yuri Terechov is a Galina Starovoitova Fellow with the Kennan Institute, and he's currently researching anti-war grassroots resistance movements. So each of our guests is going to have 10 to 12 minutes to speak, and then we're going to have a question and answer session. So we have both an in-person and an online audience. For our online audience, if you'd like to ask a question, you can submit the question in one of three ways. Via email, kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter, @Kennan Institute, or via Facebook. And please remember to include your name and affiliation when submitting your questions. So, Sergei.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me here. And coming on my way here, I started to remember the political transformation in Russia, in the Soviet Union in 1991. And I came to the conclusion that this time is different. In 1991, a lot of experts, until the Soviet Union collapsed, let's say until end October 1991, when Boris Yeltsin invited Yegor Gaidar and his team to promote economic reforms, even in mid-October, it was not evident that the Soviet Union will collapse, will disappear. In mid-October, leaders of 12 republics met in Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan, trying to negotiate a new type of loose confederation, economic treaty, and so on and so forth. And in the Soviet Union, the key problem was economic reform. So until end October 1991, there was no political discussions. Nobody was negotiating or debating what to do with the judicial system, what to do with the electoral system. The parliament, both in the Soviet Union, the parliament disappeared in September, but the parliament in Russia was elected on a very strange law. It was Congress and the Supreme Soviet. And nevertheless, members of the parliament were legitimate, and the parliament was legitimate, and the parliament was able to adopt any laws. But everybody believed that the key problem is economy, and that was true. That was true. The Soviet Union, to a great extent, collapsed because of its weak economy, a collapsed economy. Moreover, it was evident for the government. The key issue was the transformation of planned economy to a market one, and the key decision to be taken is liberalization of prices. So that is the main trigger. You cannot do it step by step. You should do it overnight, one day or next day, but it doesn't matter. And even the Politburo of the Communist Party agreed that we need. But until the end of the Soviet Union, the Politburo and Gorbachev did not decide when to do it, and how to do it, and why to do it. But all other economists were well aware what to do. There were 500 days plan, there were different discussions. So on the economic side of the transformation, everything was clear, and everybody agreed that the Soviet Union should go to the market economy. But suddenly the Soviet Union disappeared. The idea to go to the market economy was in place. It was necessary to do, and there was no big discussion. So there was no opponents or transformation of the economic system, but at the same time, Communist Party collapsed, and so a political system should be transformed. Step by step, it became evident that in Russia we have to have historical transformation of everything. Nevertheless, there was no debate. It happened somehow, and the trigger was the collapse of the Soviet Union. This time is different because we know that political transformation will come. Moreover, we know that there are no big problems on the economic side. So, yes, of course, the role of the government or the role of the state in the Russian economy is too big, and maybe it is necessary to new wave of privatization and debureaucratization and liberalization, but it's not urgent. I can tell you that if we put a list of 10 the most important decisions in post-Putin's Russia, economy will not be none of them. So economy will be something 25, 27, so not urgent. But we know very well that we need judicial system, we need independence of court, we need elimination of KGB, and so on and so forth. A lot of political reforms. But in the Soviet Union, the necessity of economic reforms was recognized by the leadership. And the Soviet government debated within itself, debated within experts what to do and how to do. So experts, independent experts, non-governmental experts, were able to discuss, debate with the government what to do. And by the end of 1991, it was general agreement. This time is different because no one in the current government, broad government, let's say, presidential administration, parliament, government itself, nobody is ready even to pronounce that Russia needs political transformation. Nevertheless, everybody knows very well that the trigger is the disappearance of Mr. Putin, one way or another. It doesn't matter. It may happen tomorrow, it may happen 20 years later, but still it will happen. And Russia needs political transformation, and there is no discussions, there is no debates, there is no consensus about what to do and how to do. Moreover, Russian society is disintegrated and is not able, it's not possible to launch such a discussion within Russia because it will be a treason, and being outside of Russia, people believe that there are much more issues to discuss rather than future. And by the way, you cannot debate political transformation without bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is in Moscow. And that leads me to a conclusion that when, not if, but when Putin will leave the political scene, Russia will experience the period of instability. There are two potential scenarios. One, let's say we may call it peaceful transformation, that everything goes according to the law, according to the constitution. Putin leaves the power, leaves the Kremlin. Once again, doesn't matter how and why. And the prime minister, who is the prime minister at that time, becomes the acting president. In 3 months election, the acting president became a president. And the rest depends on who is this person, how strong he is, how he's able to build relationship with other groups in the society, in the political elites. What is the political cycle in the parliament? Are elections to the parliament this year, next year, 5 years from now? So he will need time to negotiate all this and to build his personal coalition. Yeah? The other scenario would say that everything goes not according to the law, and some fight for the power starts, and a new person emerge as a leader of Russia, and that may lead us either to dictatorship or, after some transformations, negotiations, once again he will opt for, let's say, more or less legitimate process with elections and so on. But we have to remember that in Putin's time, in the last 15 years, maybe starting from 2007, the electoral law in Russia has changed significantly. And for example, a lot of political opposition leaders or ordinary people, ordinary politicians, they are not allowed to be elected. Some of them are not allowed to be elected for the next 10 years. Even if Alexei Navalny will leave the prison today, according to the Russian law, he is not allowed to be elected next 20 years. 20. Yeah? And in order to change this law, the parliament should vote. And are you sure that the new president and new leader of Russia will control the parliament at that particular time? Or there will be some other guys? And will the parliament vote? And you need to negotiate the new elections. The parliament should dissolve itself, vote for, resign from the parliament, so every majority. So all this will lead to the period of instability, and all dreams about Russia needs political reform, Russia needs rule of law, Russia needs political competition. It will not happen tomorrow. It will not happen immediately after Putin will leave his office. Is there any way to accelerate this process? Maybe. And of course, the key player is the consolidated West, is Washington, is White House, maybe it's Euro Commission as well, Brussels. The new leader of Russia will have a choice what to do. To continue Putin's way, maybe with some slow liberalization, or to make radical transformation and to say, okay, let's come back. Let's forget about Putin and his last X years, and let's be members of the Western community, of the civilized world once again. The key scenario in this situation is that Washington will not be ready to make any decisions. Washington will not be ready to make any promises. By that time, Washington was tired of Russia, because Putin's war in Ukraine, maybe some others' war, will exhaust all patience here, financial resources, and so on and so far. But if the West has no clear position immediately at the day one when Putin leaves the office, that means that Russia will be in this very, very slow and unpredictable process of transformation. So that's my position. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for organizing this event. Actually, I'm a bit flattered that my mere idea just to make my today's stay in Washington, to make it less annoying, somehow comes out that this big event, and I also thank my colleagues that they agreed to take part in it, and so the idea to speak about the best possible scenarios for Russia came to me actually last November, when I attended a big meeting in Europe featuring a crowd of statesmen and military-related people, and there was also a high-ranked U.S. official. I can't unfortunately disclose his name today, but one of the questions addressed to that guy was, what is the best possible scenario for Russia in an American perspective? And he answered immediately, I don't know, and I was just, how? So how's it possible? So maybe it's time to know. And since that, I talked to a number of people in American think tanks, in German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of course in Prague, and I realized that probably nobody knows. Yeah, actually, this is a big problem, because I think that this existential war that is going on, and Ukrainians pay lives for that, and the sooner we understand why, what is the strategic goal of this war, not just to defend Ukraine, but probably to change the situation, to eliminate the threat of this ugly regime that is probably can be described now as a totalitarian. Because 2 weeks ago I was in Los Angeles to attend the APSA annual conference, exactly roundtable on totalitarianism, and my presentation was about is Russia a totalitarian state? I think probably not yet, but we are moving in that direction, and somehow the world and the pro-Ukrainian coalition has to clarify the strategic goal. What is the best possible scenario for Russia? Because otherwise, if you don't understand it, probably you can't make significant progress. And so far, talking to many people, I think that the most realistic one is what I call minor son of a bitch scenario, and implying by that some pragmatists in the Kremlin would replace Mr. Putin, and I see it as a more or less desired version here in Washington D.C., and I see it as soon as this pragmatists manage to rein in their boss, they would find a compromise. And unfortunately, this is not very good for Russians, because that means that the regime is going to be more or less the same for many years. At this point, I'm trying to learn from experience of the Cuban guys in Miami, and I met some of them and talked to them a lot about it, and they totally understand my concerns. And but again, there is lack of integrity regarding the best possible scenarios of Russia. So you can just read a bunch of articles published in recent months about it, and some people say Russia should be a democratic country, but they don't explain how. Others, and mostly in Eastern Europe, say let's just, kind of radical isolationism, mode with crocodiles, very famous in social networks. And some other guys just say, anything but not strengthening China, anything but not lose control over the nuclear weapons, and so on. And then I call it lack of integrity, because I don't see feasible plans leading to these wishful thinking ideas, realization of these ideas. So at this point, there's this feasibility and wishful thinking ratio. So just maybe to make it clear, I'm not only an academic guy, not only a researcher. I also represent anti-Putin Russian-speaking community in Prague. It's quite big. We organized the biggest event in the world of Russians against Putin in March last year, like several thousand of people out of 20,000 living in Prague. And we established connections to like-minded people in all over Europe. And now I met also some groups in the United States, and I think that maybe this anti-Putin diaspora organization could be an important tool, political tool, to make pressure over this regime, and particularly if we're talking about years. So that's why I mentioned the Cubans of Miami, and that's why I'm thinking of something that once upon a time was made by Mascanosa, like Cuban American Foundation. So I think we have to follow more or less the same path. There's a very big difference because we live in a postmodernist age. There is internet, and there are so many ways of communication. Also, without our counterparts inside Russia, still there are people there who could be on our side, and we have to help them. And internet is a great medium to establish these connections and to make them more important. At this point, of course, it's essential it's up to Russian example leaders of opinions like Mr. Kasparov, Mr. Khodorkovsky, that they would contribute to this plan. And I obviously met them and talked with them about it. But so far, I think they are a bit stuck in the past, and we have to maybe to endorse them with numbers, like if we're talking about dozens of communities all over the world, thousands of people, maybe dozens of thousands. So that's more or less the plan. But at this point, we seek also some endorsement, some help from decision makers in Washington and Brussels, and Mr. Kubilius, former Prime Minister of Lithuania, is a great help, and he's now a member of European Parliament, and in June he organized a major event on this agenda. Here in Washington, so far, I have some connections, and I'm looking forward to going on with that. So far, that's all that I wanted to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm very grateful to the organizers who invited me here. I agree with many points which were put forward by the previous speakers. I would try not to repeat what was said already, starting with the idea that if we talk about post-Putin scenarios or post-Putin future, so the prerequisite is Putin has gone. This looks like a good aim or an ideal situation for many of Western policymakers. For example, I would remind the words of President Biden, who said that for God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. This was said 18 months ago when Mr. President was addressing people in Warsaw, Poland on the 26th of March 2022. And since that time, actually nothing happened, which possibly made the departure of Mr. Putin even a little bit closer. So my point is that we should look on realistic scenarios, and we shouldn't, dream of something that might happen in Russia, like a national revolt, a democratic transition, because nothing of this can actually happen in the country, which is ruled by Mr. Putin for 25 years and which has a long tradition of authoritarian and dictatorial rulings. Because if Mr. Alexashenko remembered the times of perestroika, I would also say that in Gorbachev times, it took around 3 years from 1985 till 1988 for implementing a little signs of democracy into the Soviet society, which these 3 years passed between the announcement of perestroika in 1985 and the first steps toward a quasi-democratic elections of 1989. And the people were actually not prepared for democracy. I think to return to democratic rule, to genuine democracy, it will take even more time and even more effort these days. The same thing is, I would say, about the influence of immigrant opposition groups, which are, to my point of view, quite not very popular inside Russia, and they are much divorced from the Russian agenda these days, pursuing their own goals, first of all, in Europe and the United States. And the third scenario, which is also debated somehow, and in many places, is that the Ukrainian victory, or even the introduction of, or use of Russian pro-Ukrainian forces, which can, infiltrate or even invade the Russian Federation from the part of Ukraine, can change the situation in Russia, which is absolutely unrealistic to my point of view. So, therefore, I would say that the most probable scenario for post-Putin transition is, of course, the inter-elite regrouping, which may happen after Putin's death from natural reasons, or after a kind of elitist coup d'etat, which also can happen because inside the Russian elite there are a lot of groups and people who are very much disappointed with where the country is going, and with the understanding that no one knows actually where Russia is now heading. So therefore, it can be either after Putin's death or after some kind of inter-elite coup that the regime changes. And what I would like to say is that, to my mind, this regime change is actually something in which the Western powers should be much more interested than they are interested now, or they seemingly are interested now, because I believe that it's very improbable, very I would say very improbable that Ukraine can defeat the Russian Federation on the battlefield these days. It can liberate all its territories, and even more that this liberation, even if it happens, will either stop or eliminate the danger from the Russian Federation to Ukraine and to the whole free world, or it can lead to demise of Russian imperialistic regime. So therefore, my major point is that for the Western powers, the most important strategic thinking today, or the most important strategy to be elaborated, is the strategy not how to act after the day one, as Sergei said, that means after Putin's death or disappearance, but actually how to make this day closer. And how it's possible to influence the Russian elites and the Russian influential groups inside Russia, because only they matter for the Russian political developments. How to influence them in a way that may bring Putin's regime to an end sooner rather than later. And of course, once again, I will repeat, my prediction is that even if Putin disappears, somehow the Russian transformation will take a long time, because unlike during the Soviet times, there are many factors which prevent the radical change in Russia. First of all, I would say that there is a lot of vested interests which will command the system to exist for many years to come. There is a lot of property accumulated in Russia by oligarchs, by other elite members, which should be defended and which they would wish to defend. There are a lot of people who were engaged into Putin's policies, were violating even the existing Russian rules for years or decades. So therefore, they will try to secure themselves from any kind of prosecution. So all this will require the change to be very limited and very slow. So therefore, once again, I will maybe even finish here. My point is that what the West should realize, that there is a lot of people in Russia and on the top of the Russian politics as well, who are interested in stopping this, disastrous policies which Mr. Putin pursues. So this is point one. So the West should, I would say, send some signals to these people that it has some more concrete and precise goals connected to Russia. That is, the goal is not to democratizing Russia, not to make it immediately a country where the Western values are dominating, or the rule of law or the human rights are very much honored. But any kind of move from current Putin system into something more democratic, more law-abiding, more pro-Western would be welcomed. And this signal, I think, should be heard, and it should be very clearly formulated, because now it seems to me that the Western governments, they fear any change in Russia because of possible instability, because of possible dissolution of the Russian Federation, because of losing control over the nuclear weapons, and this list can be continued, till indefinitely. So, therefore, from the part of the West, it should be said that we don't want and we don't expect, actually, huge and immediate change in Russia, but we will definitely welcome and we will work for it to initiate some pro-Western change and actually to finish the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So I believe that not Ukrainian victory will change Russia, but the change in Russia will end the war in Ukraine. Only this way of thinking can produce some kind of results, because otherwise we will see this war continuing for another 3, 5, 10 years, because Russia is really quite sufficient in its resources to continue it for years. And if Mr. Putin is not deposed, if the Russian government has not changed, I think this war will not end. So I will finish here saying that only constant and slow change is, to my mind, the most probable post-Putin scenario. Of course, it was said that many Russian politicians would be banned from politics for dozens of years. I agree. I'm not, dreaming about Navalny being Russian president in a couple of years. It's close to impossible, because even, for example, if he looks on himself like on another Mr. Mandela, one should remember that for Mr. Mandela becoming president of South Africa, it should be another Mr. de Klerk who actually initiated change. Like for Mr. Yeltsin to become Russia's president, it should be Mr. Gorbachev who initiated perestroika. So therefore, I would say once again that the change in Russia will start with the Russian elites, and the Western powers should do their best to find and to indicate to the Russian elites that what they're expecting from them, and to encourage them to initiate this change, not putting the major accent, the major hopes, not enshrining the major hopes for either immigrant opposition or for democratic movement inside the Russian Federation. Thank you.
Dear friends, esteemed colleagues, and honored guests, I am really grateful for the opportunity to address you today and to share my vision for the future of Russian society and state. But first of all, I must express my regret that there isn't a single woman among the speakers today, given the invaluable role they play in Russian anti-war movement. Their presence here would have been both fitting and logical, regardless of their formal titles and academic affiliations. Without them, our discussion here is incomplete and one-sided. I know that organizers are trying to maintain a gender balance, and I also admit my own failure in this. But I urge future roundtable participants to give this serious consideration. From my perspective, most projections for post-Putin Russia rely on fundamental scientific assumptions. People often discuss economic and legal aspects, and occasionally we even hear some, to my view, nonsense about so-called latent or dreaming institutions. These conversations often overlook a crucial component: what truly constitutes Russian identity. What do we really have a unified political nation? What binds us together and why? Where are our borders? I believe we are currently witnessing a crisis on Russian identity. Putin says that Russia's borders are limitless, but even some Russian opposition intellectuals, usually men, often fail to define the boundaries of Russian culture. This creates friction and conflicts with neighboring nations and with peoples still under Russia's colonial dominance. Contemporary Russian identity is overly ambiguous and toxically inclusive, that is imperialist. Let's keep this in mind. There are indeed numerous potential trajectories for post-Putin Russia, but rather than talking about the government or the state, I will talk about the people, the society. Last week I attended an event featuring a representative of Russian civil society. He spoke about the uncertainties of how the regime would fall, yet he was optimistic that once it falls, civic institutions would spontaneously emerge, as they supposedly did after in the perestroika era. I asked him, why does Russian society always react, waiting passively for another stupid, insane decision by the authorities or a change of political climate? How can we ensure that the civil society gains influence and becomes a genuine agent of change? Sadly, I received no clear answer. And while I'm a professional, I'm not a professional political scientist, but more of a political creator, I would like to share my vision of how we can empower the most active segment of Russian society to avert the most apocalyptic scenarios. First and foremost, I would like to highlight the experience of grassroots civil initiatives after the start of this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. These are the seeds, in my view, of the future and renewed civil society. Grassroots initiatives spanning from humanitarian and feminist organizations, movements, and to the colonial youth and new media groups are often decentralized and self-organized. They prioritize inclusivity, bottom-up decision-making, and active participation. Operating outside of the traditional power structures, they remain interconnected, and that makes them immune to repression. These groups offer a model for a more democratic and just society in the post-war era, a society where citizens have a voice and freedom to shape their future. Their vast diversity can reach social segments previously untouched by Russian oppositional politics and movements. It's a pity that their experience is underreported in the Western media. Secondly, there is a pressing need to develop independent think tanks, independent also from the old guard of the Russian opposition that failed its mission. The role of those think tanks will be to craft models of political existence on a non-imperial and non-authoritarian basis. This would include drafting reform agendas, nation-building strategies, and fostering new political parties and movements. This vision of the future must reflect our society's diversity, resonate with the core of our national spirit, and prioritize the freedom and well-being of its citizens over the notions of state grandeur, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. Lastly, building the own military force is an imperative, regardless of how provocative it may sound. It's an essential component in power transition. Relying on the regime's humanization after Putin, or hoping that Western nations will force Russian elites to welcome returning opposition leaders seem naive. Currently, we witness just another trend towards unstable nuclear totalitarianism. In the chaos that will likely erupt in the Russian Federation as a result of either front's collapse, the loss of centralized control, Putin's death, the emergence of armed factions, it is crucial for the free Russians and free world to establish a robust presence on the ground, both civil and military. This can then serve as a foundation of a new state and security apparatus. And just concluding, I want to share a story. Just yesterday, I came back from Minnesota. Surprisingly, it was there where I witnessed a vibrant grassroots organization of free Russians, anti-Putin Russians, which beyond political actions genuinely focus on building horizontal bonds among themselves. These are young, open-minded Russians who support Ukrainians and each other, cherish their culture, reinterpret their identity, and infuse it with new meanings. They set an example for similar Russian communities worldwide and in Russia itself. I'm deeply moved by this experience and profoundly thankful to the energetic leader of this community, Elena Mitushina, for inviting me there and giving me a chance to see it with my own eyes. Russians can be a normal nation, so let's give them this chance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our guests for your excellent comments, and you all stayed under your time, so that gives us even more time for question and answer. I want to invite now, we've got, again, both an in-person and an online audience. So for the online audience, as a reminder, you can submit your questions in 3 ways. You can do it by email, by Twitter, or by Facebook, and then they will populate up here for me, and obviously I can see the people who are present. So maybe to start off, I've got 2 questions, and then I'll start taking from the audience. First question directed at Vladislav. I think a lot of policymakers are going to find it fascinating that you were shifting the focus, right, from when Ukraine defeats Russia to saying we need to act now and be more preemptive. And you said act now, and you said it concretely. And I'm just wondering, maybe can you offer a couple of examples of what you think would be concrete actions that, in your perspective, the West should be taking now, maybe to move things in the direction you think they should be going?
Thank you so very much for this question. I would say that I do not have a precise plan for this, definitely. But first of all, I think there should be a clear sign that the Western powers do not exclude a kind of agenda for regime change vis-à-vis Russia, because they really do not believe Putin can stay in power for a long time after what he did to Ukraine and to the world. So this should be not only a small remark by the president said 1.5 years ago, but something much more profound and much more official. The second point is that it should be some assessment of the internal Russian assessment of possible contradictions inside the Russian elites, because there are many, and we can see this by many features inside Russia and outside, and actually to analyze what means the West has, for example, to undermine the unity of the Russian elites. It might be a lot of issues here, because when Sergei said that, when Sergei talked about 1991 and other periods of Russian history, I would say that today the West possesses much more levers to influence Russian situation, because, for example, you have the sanction policy, and these instruments, they put together the Russian elites actually much more than divide them. For example, just imagine what may happen if the Western analysts analyze, so this can structure the Russian people who are sanctioned, personally sanctioned by the Western powers, and find out maybe 20, 30, 40 people, politicians, mayors, oligarchs, whatsoever, who are the least involved into Russia's war against Ukraine, and just lift these sanctions. What Mr. Putin will think about this next day? So he sees that 25 people from the State Duma, mayors, governors, they are not sanctioned anymore. Why? Are they traitors? What should he think? He is very, after Prigozhin's coup, the people, no one even trusts anyone in the Kremlin and around it. So just add to this distrust and add to this uncertainty inside the Russian elite. It can bear some fruits. So anyway, moreover, I would say that the European Union, the West in general, should quite clearly say that after Russia, and if Russia changes its course, it can be regarded as a part of the Western world once again, because in early 90s it was not said quite clearly. Many countries, for example, Ukraine, of course I admire the Ukrainian people and what they are doing these days, but Ukraine is a candidate to the European Union. Maybe if Russia would be proclaimed a candidate to the European Union in 1990s, the course of events would be much different. So anyway, saying that we are staying for the change of the power elite in Russia, that we want and we will seek any means of undermining the unity of the Russian elites, that we will support any kind of internal movements in Russia, not outside but in Russia, aimed on undermining the Putin's rule. And if these forces succeed, Russia will be included in the Western community. I think these are the first steps which can be done. But this will show that the West has changed its position, because now it seems like it is fostering, it's championing the status quo.
I'm not arguing with Vladislav, but my first advice, if you want to split Russian elites, if you want to split Russian society, if you want to support, if you West want to support the anti-Putin's intentions, first, not do the opposite. Yeah? First, do not consolidate Russian society around Putin. Do not adopt decisions like Eurocommission said, no Russians can visit Europe on its own car, personal car, because it's export. Even if your car is 10 years old, it's export. So we ban entry to European Union on your personal cars. Please do not humiliate Russians who live in Europe and any other countries with visa regimes, with access to banking accounts and so on. They're people, they have human rights. Please support those Russians who left Russia, who live outside. It's not an easy life to live outside of Russia if you spend previous 30, 40 years in that country. Please announce stipendiums for Russians aged 20 to 25 to get education in the Western universities. Do it. Do it. Show the other way. Do not tell them that, okay, guys, you are Russians, stay within your borders. It's your concentration camp. We don't want you to leave. This is the message today Russians receive from the West. If you want changes, start with stopping your practice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Powerful message. Okay, that was. Let's open questions, and I'll try and alternate back and forth between in-person. Yes, please. Yes, I should say, please wait for the microphone to come to you.
Hello, my name is Elena Davlikanova. I am a democracy fellow with the Center for European Policy Analysis, and thank you for your thoughts. I would like to ask you, there was such a statement that please don't, how do you say it? Let's help Russians to be a decent nation, something of the kind. Who prevents Russians from being a decent nation? And when you are saying that lifting sanctions today against average citizens, against political elites, would help Russia to integrate into the civilized world, what prevented Russia to do it the previous 30 years? Because as far as I remember, European Union was very clear that it wanted to have a common space from Vladivostok to Lisbon, and all these policies, they were there. And unfortunately, it didn't work. So maybe it's time to try something else.
You really want to debate the Russian history of the recent 25 years under Vladimir Putin. It will be another topic. But let me tell you what didn't happen. When Mr. Medvedev was the president, he proposed to negotiate the treaty between Russia and the West on the United Europe from Lisbon to Vladivostok. United States diplomats looked on this treaty and said, 80% we can accept immediately. But the United States never started to negotiate or any of such treaties. So Tenga, it's for both sides. It's not for only one. We could blame Mr. Putin. We could blame Russian society. We can blame Russian opposition. We can blame Mr. Yeltsin. We can blame Gaidar. We can blame Alexashenko for unsuccessful reforms of the 90s. Everything. But it's a history. You really want to debate the history right now, or you want to look for the future?
Just wait a moment. Look, I didn't say that we should lift sanctions and for integrating Russia into the wider world. No, my point was quite different. We can try to lift some sanctions for igniting more conflicts inside the Russian elite. It was just about starting the post-Putin transition. It was nothing about to integrate Russia into Europe. It was. I didn't say that we should lift sanctions just to bring some oligarchs or some bureaucrats to Europe for some reason. It was just only about to start the war of everyone against everyone inside Putin's inner circle. That's it. In All other points I completely agree with Sergey.
Yuri and then Dennis, yeah.
Well, I mentioned that Russians can be normal nation, but I totally admit that Russian society is deeply sick. That's true. But there are examples. There are examples of those Russians trying to change, trying to redefine their identity, their mindset, and I think it's better for everyone, probably for the world, to support these efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the alternative representation of Russianness is something probably that the world needs more than Russian emigres, because people who were brave enough to leave the country and very strange, weird circumstances. Usually they have enough life energy to adapt to even hostile environment, and this happens to so many diasporas in the world, and that's fine. So far we still have this potential to organize this people who left Russia in recent 2 years, and to help them to create something that could be recognized institutionally on the institutional level, which actually would challenge the monopoly of the Kremlin to represent Russianness, Russian people, and would help politically to world centers of making decisions. So I think this representation is something that worlds need more than the Russians.
Excellent. So gentlemen, the gentleman right there. Thank you.
Ilya Levin, formerly of the Department of State, U.S. Foreign Service. My question is for Vladislav Inozemtsev, well, actually for anyone. Vladislav said that the end of the Putin regime will mean the end of the Ukraine war. What I'm curious about is the kind of reverse scenario. The end of the Ukraine war might trigger the changes in Russia, because no matter how the war ends, and it's important to remember that the regime never articulated its vision of victory, so no matter how the war ends, it will be seen by many, and in particular by the Russian quote-unquote turbo patriots, as Russia's defeat. And they will blame for their defeat those who prevented Russia from achieving victory, no matter how you define it. Putin, the Kremlin, the elites. After the war ends, there will be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Russian war veterans coming back to Russia, full of anger. We all remember those thousands of Soviet war veterans in Afghanistan who returned to the Soviet Union and later formed the backbone of organized crime in Russia. The Ukrainian war veterans will be far more numerous, far more angry, and I would imagine quite a few of them will still be armed. So I'm interested in any of the panelists' views on this kind of scenario.
Thank you so much. Look, I actually, in general, I disagree with the idea about the huge impact of the end of the war in Ukraine for Russian politics. So it should be, so there are two major outcomes of the war. First, Ukraine wins and restores its territorial integrity. In this case, the Russian propaganda will do everything to say that we are defeated by the collective West, then we cannot stay against this huge force, we should, economize our people, and blah, blah, blah. And so then we should regroup, and in 10 years we will regain our facilities. So therefore, in this case, I cannot see how Mr. Putin should, lose his power. If the war is stopped on the current front line, the Russian leadership will claim that it saved the people of Donbass, it regained some historical Russian territories, it's a kind of victory. No one actually speaks now about taking Kiev. And saying about Turbo Patriots, I wouldn't overestimate their numbers. Because, for me it was a very interesting point that Mr. Girkin or Strelkov, who is one of the most celebrated and popular Turbo Patriots, it had around 600,000 subscribers in his Telegram page, and only 3 or 4 people appeared near the courthouse where he was sentenced to prison. So this is, I would say, the ratio. 500,000 supporters in the internet, 10 people on the streets. So therefore, once again, about talking about the veterans of this campaign. Actually, I'm not sure that they will. The people, the Soviet veterans of Afghan war, actually emerged not in 1948 or 45 or 46, when there were also numerous. The war started in 1979. They emerged during the chaos years of the early 90s. So if the regime is still strong, no one will appear as a destructive force. For example, just today it was reported that a guy who joined the ЧВК Wagner forces, who was before sentenced for a murder, he was pardoned. He came back to his hometown and murdered another woman just 3 weeks ago, and he was caught on the place, and he is now once again sentenced to 11 years in prison. So this will happen quite often, I agree, but this is not a complete destabilization of the country. Destabilization comes from the top, as it was in the early 90s, not from below.
Excellent. I'm going to take a question from our online audience, and then we'll go back. So Jennifer Brush, retired OSCE ambassador to Moldova, asks, we've listened to a number of scenarios, but what about a disintegration or decentralization scenario? What are the chances that regions in Russia, such as the North Caucasus, the Sakha Republic, or Middle Volga, would see their futures independent of Russia?
Sorry, it's a bullshit. It's complete bullshit, but it's a favorite scenario here in Washington. And that's the reason, the only one scenario when Ukraine will win the war, and this will lead to the collapse of the Putin regime, is the United States will supply Ukraine with 10 times more weapons, and not 10 years from now, but immediately. Yeah, the policy too little too late make this war protracted, and it may last years. So the scenario, and I agree that Washington's view is the Ukrainian victory will lead to the collapse of the Putin's regime. That will make situation unstable and unpredictable. Today, situation is stable and predictable. Yeah, we see. Yeah, Putin is stable and he is strong and it is predictable. He is running the war and he will run the war. That's the prediction. Unlike in 1991, when it was evident the borders, how the Soviet Union will crack, because there were national republics by that time that became national countries. Today, there are no any evident borders, any evident crack lines between Russian regions. Yeah, we may take, Northern Caucasus. Northern Caucasus receives, let's say, 75% of its budgetary expenditures from the federal budget as subsidies. May they leave? Yes, may. Will it mean collapse of the Russian Federation? No. Everybody will say, yes, we're happy. Yeah, go. It's your life. Yeah, it will not be a tragedy for Russian Federation. Sakha is a region that is isolated from the world because all connection goes via Yakutsk, via railways, via roads, and it has access to the Arctic Ocean, and it cannot supply itself with anything because all Yakutia needs for the ordinary life is supplied from Russia, from mainland Russia. Can Yakutia be economically independent? Yes, why? There are a lot of countries that are much poorer than Yakutia or the Northern Caucasus, but I do not believe that Yakutia is able to generate enough of revenues to keep its territory untouched. Not say development. There will not be any development in Yakutia because they're dependent on power, they're dependent on railways, they're dependent on air traffic, and they have nothing to export except of diamonds. Diamonds are forever, I understand, but it's not enough to survive. So who else? Volga? Volga is two national republics, Bashkiria and Yakutia. Okay, they are like Tatarstan and Bashkortostan. It's like Bantustans within South Africa, Swaziland and Lesotho. Yeah, somewhere in the middle. Yes. What do they have for export? Oil and petroleum products and some chemistry. How they can reach the border of any other country except of Russia, via Russia? Can you imagine transportation tariffs? How much they will pay? Maybe they be independent? Yes, maybe. Will it be a great success for them? I doubt. So who else? That's it. That's it. Look, I believe that today in Russia there are no national leaders, regional leaders who, after the disintegration, within the disintegration of the Soviet Union, there were bright political leaders which emerged within political reforms of Gorbachev launched from 1989. Maybe such leaders will appear. Maybe conflicts between Russian regions will emerge. But today, there are no any indication. Scenarios of disintegration of the Soviet Union were debated in the Soviet Union starting from the beginning of 80s. And it was evident the construction, the country built on Lenin's principle of integrating all independent countries in 1920. Okay, it's not stable. But today, I don't see difference between Tambov, Voronezh, Lipetsk, Tyumeny, Omsk, Novosibirsk. The same region, the same people moving from one region to another, speaking the same language, having the same culture, having the common interests. So we may debate any scenario, for example, like Martians come and take away Mr. Putin and the life will be happy. Could it happen? Yes, why not?
Great. We'll take a quick comment from Vladislav and Denis, and then we'll take another question.
Very small comment on this. I admire what Sergei said from the economic point of view, but there is also an identity element, and I would remind that in the Soviet times, in 1989, it was the all-Soviet census of the population. And at that time, 3 years before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Russians, the ethnic Russians, represent 50.8% of the total population. Now they represent more than 81%. So it's a much more uni-ethnic nation, or uni-ethnic state. Moreover, only 8 elements, on 8 subjects of the Russian Federation, they do not have Russians as a dominant ethnic group. And I agree with what Sergei said about North Caucasus. It cannot, it can split. It can leave Russian Federation. It would be actually a very good thing for Russia because it's a colonized nation. The share of the Russians in Ingushetia is less than 1%. It's 7 times less than in Kyrgyzstan. So it isn't a part of the Russian Federation, genuine part. But inside different other regions, like in Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, there are a lot of ethnic mix inside this population. They don't have any particular identity. There is around 1/3 of Bashkirs in Bashkiria, 1/3 of Russians, 1/3 of Tatars, and vice versa. So it would be a very complicated issue to split the Russian Federation. I think it's, except of the remote regions like Tiva or Buryatia or North Caucasus republics, it's a rather unified nation.
Denis, and then we'll keep them quick.
Yeah, just have to say that at least some of people I know whose cause is somehow to accomplish disintegration of the Russian Federation due to their identical cultural necessities. So I have great sympathy because I think some of these people are really great, and but yes, and at this point I also have to say that in my personal world of pink unicorns, to build a European-style Russian democracy is much easier in a small piece of land like Kaliningrad or maybe St. Petersburg. But yes, I think that you have to think about feasibility and wishful thinking ratio. And also, I recall I attended in Prague last summer so-called Forum of Free Russian Peoples of Russia, and it was unfortunately kind of desperate event, and if I had to make this idea less popular, probably this event would be the best solution. So people who really want to think about to follow this path, they definitely have to consider better and more presentable ways to do it.
May I disagree? I think that's actually quite possible in my view, this integration of Russia, because well, Russia has disintegrated in the past quite a few times, regardless of economic, ethnic, other considerations and reasoning. And in the situation of chaos that might erupt in Russia, I suppose, and in a situation where there is no actually any unified, uniting identity, rather than the cult of victory in the Second World War, and Putin, the figure of Putin, it's some regions, some elites can decide to go their own way. So. But we don't know for sure.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Gentleman down here, we have a question.
Greetings, Ariel Cohen, the Atlantic Council. 2 questions. I started out in this business a long time ago, looking at the then Soviet public opinion. We did a lot of polling of people traveling to the West, which had its own limiting factors. But when you're looking today at all the data that is available, this poll, that poll, lack of any kind of demonstrations, any kind of protests, somewhere, the gut feeling, somewhere between 60 and 75% of the population are not against this war. Mm-hmm. Probably something like 60+% in this media environment, this is a horrible media environment, probably support Putin one way or another. And when we're talking about some kind of a transformation, if miraculously something happens with Mr. Putin and he goes to outer space, the military, the security apparatus, the military-industrial complex, the circles that are by their own beliefs and faiths nationalist, this is still a majority of the country and the majority of the guns in the country. So how are you envisaging this transition to something that is compatible with the collective West, with Europe and the US? And who is going to allow the leaders from these wonderful non-governmental organizations to take any kind of a political position of power? Question mark.
I think I tried to be as pessimistic as I could and matching your question more or less. So I share this skepticism, and I think that if we agree that we want to change this brutal reality, if you do, as I do, so probably we have to think about long-term perspective, long-term efforts, and that's my solution, just to start from outside and to help in getting together a serious institution of Russians outside of Russia. That could be, well, if it could be at least 1/4 of that potential that Cuban created in Florida, I would be super happy. And but I think that it can't be done by the existing associations of Russian immigrants, because the overall potential of them is unfortunately quite low. And if you want this eventual institution would be taken seriously by millions of Russians living outside of Russia, it should be endorsed by decision makers in Washington and Brussels, and that's the whole point.
Ariel, we remember the Soviet Union, both of us. And somewhere in 1970, who was in charge? Leonid Brezhnev. In 1971, Leonid Brezhnev. And in 1981, Leonid Brezhnev. That was my life. And in 1981, okay, Brezhnev, then who? Andropov, then Chernenko, then Grishin, then blah, blah, blah. All those guys, that's bullshit. Can you become Olympic champion in 100 meters running, athletics? Honest answer from you. Can you be? Can you win Olympics in 100 meters? Why not? If you are allowed to choose your competitors. So that's about Putin. That's about Putin. Next March, there will be a procedure called presidential elections. Putin will decide who will compete him. Zyuganov, Mironov, artificial intelligence Zhirinovsky. Okay, that's a great company. Of course, he's much better. And there is a generation of Russians that never saw any other political leader except of Putin. So if you look on the polls, whom of politicians you may name, it's not trust Putin or distrust Putin. Name anyone. Putin, Mishustin, Shoigu, Lavrov, Zyuganov, that's it. That's it. Of course, Russian people, I disagree they support the war. Yes, there is, let's say, 20 to 25% of Russians who are ready to fight. We want to show that we are the biggest nation, the strongest nation in the world. If you are afraid, you respect us. There's another 15 to 20% who say anti-war. Some of them are sitting here. And there is the middle, 60, 65%, who don't care, doesn't care. It's too complicated to decide what's going on. We have a president. Let him decide. If president believes it's a right decision to run the war, let it be the war. If tomorrow Putin will sign an agreement with Zelensky that the war is over, Russia is paying 300 billion compensation to Ukraine, fine, perfect. It's his job. So when you say 60-70% of Russians, they support the war, no. Majority of them support Putin because they don't know any other leader. And I agree with Vladislav, it seems to me, he said, transformation of post-Putin Russia will not be very fast. It will be much slower than in 90s. And when Mr. Medvedev became a president, there was a joke in Russia that Putin by that time was the prime minister. And prime minister and president agreed which way to follow, Korean way. But they have disagreed, South Korea or North Korea. It's a joke, but today Russia have the same choice, where to go, North Korea and South Korea. And there will no be answer to this question until Putin will leave the office. And the role of the West to explain to Russians that the way of South Korea is a little bit better than North Korea. If you can do it, it will take. Korea started its transformation in 1980, so it will take another 30 years for Russia. It's a generation, yes, but it could happen.
Yeah, well, actually, that's exactly what I was talking about. Many observers and Russian opposition politicians often overlook the presence of this huge security apparatus in Russia, and they don't have a real plan to how to deal with this and with those returning soldiers from the war. And so in this situation, I think without building the own security force, those dreams about the wonderful future, wonderful Russia of the future, quite naive and not really well grounded.
Excellent. So we take this question and then we'll move to the back.
Thank you. Sam Green from SIPA and King's College London. I want to push forward a little bit on Ariel's question, because I think it points to a tension, right, in what people have been talking about in terms of the transition and the objective, right? Because there's one objective which is about ending the war, right, and getting Russia back on some kind of a new footing with the rest of the world. And there's another issue, which is democracy, right? And it strikes me these two things don't necessarily go hand in hand, right? If you're going to want to end the war, if you're going to want to get to reparations, if you're going to want to get to again a different relationship with the West, you're going to need to explain to people that you were lied to, right? That this was a mistake, and that everything that you believed fervently or because it was convenient to believe it, right, for however many years, was in fact not worth believing. Right? It's going to be a lot easier to do that if you get to pick your opponents in the presidential election, if you control the Duma, if you have a controlled transition, if you have an elite transition that has a consensus about who takes power. It's going to be a lot easier for that person to make that leap on the war. Right? If, on the other hand, the transit involves an election which may or may not be free or fair, but would be competitive, there's going to be people in that election who are campaigning for those, 60% of the population who found it convenient to believe that the war was justified. And anybody else who wants to believe the things that we would all love for Russians to believe, right, is going to have a much harder hill to climb. Right. So if, first of all, is that tension one that we should be worried about? And second of all, if it is a tension, which is the priority? Ending the war or democracy?
Ending the war is priority, but post-Putin transformation is inevitability. It will happen one way or another. And you may remember transformation of Stalin regime when Khrushchev came to power only in 1956, 3 years after Stalin's death. And within those 3 years, something strange happened in the Soviet leadership. Brezhnev died in 1982, Gorbachev came to power in 1985, 3 years of transition, plus another 2 years of transition for Gorbachev and changing his views, so 5 years. Don't estimate that immediately after Putin will leave the office one way or another, Russia will change to democracy. No, it's necessity. The new leader of Russia, of course, as I said, he will have a choice to follow Putin's way or to choose for something else. Maybe, we don't know who is this guy. Maybe by the time he becomes an acting president, he knows the answer to this question. Maybe. And if the answer is to choose the way of South Korea, he should fly to Washington saying, okay, let's make a deal. Let's make a deal immediately. Because I have, 100, 500 days to explain to Russians that it's Putin who is responsible for all problems. I agree with Vladislav that a lot of people in Russian elites, they don't like the war. They are paying a huge price. They're suffering from this war. But they are not brave enough to resist because they have no exit. They're in a submarine, not yellow submarine, but together with Putin. There is no exit from the submarine when you are, 10,000 feet below the water. So you have no exit. You have to stay there until the submarine will go to the surface. Yeah? Yes, they are. And I understand that Russia is not an Asian country. It will never be China. It will never be Uzbekistan. It will never be Iran. Russia is okay, it's a specific European country. But there are many specific European countries with their specific mentality. Russia is different. Yes, Russia is different. But they want to be in Russia. They want to be in Europe. And they will negotiate. Maybe the next leader of Russia, after Putin, he will choose North Korea. Yes. But guys, it's your job to explain that South Korea is a little bit better.
Just a very small remarks to your question. Very good question, actually. Look, I would focus on two elements which are almost omnipresent in the Russian history. First is that the Russian history evolves like a kind of a pendulum. So if Mr. Putin or Mr. Stalin moves the situation into growing totalitarianism, the society becomes tired of this, and it's much more probable that the pendulum will move a little bit otherwise. Then it will continue to move to even bigger totalitarianism. So I do not expect Mr. Putin will be succeeded with Mr. Patrushev the Elder, with even more anti-Western rhetorics and so on. Then the next point is also a very common pattern to the Russian history, because a new leader can build his or her authority only in annihilating the credentials of his predecessor, because Mr. Putin really, he is popular, he is charismatic, and so you cannot be better than Mr. Putin. You should dismiss his legacy to become actually a new leader of Russia. You should say that he was wrong in everything, like, for example, Khrushchev said about Stalin in 1956, like Gorbachev said about the whole Soviet time. So therefore, I really do not believe in continuous totalization of the Russian society. It is almost impossible. So therefore, I would not fear the transformation and even the kind of a chaos in Russia, because it will lead to much better political environment than it is now.
Great. I'm going to take a question first from the online audience, then we'll go back. So this actually builds on the comment, Sergey, you were making about kind of a plea for treatment of people who fled, and also, Yuri, what you're talking about, the grassroots movements you're seeing. So this question, should the West provide more forms of humanitarian protection for Russians fleeing mobilization and political repressions?
Yes, for sure. And we have a case of Belarus where the same the dictator of the same type, for example, he banned Belarusian political oppositioners to renew their passports when they expire in the consulates. For example, today, I am allowed to visit the Russian consulate and to change my passport if it expired. But it is up to Putin saying, okay, let's stop this procedure.
Mm-hmm.
If my passport expires, what I'm going to do? How I will survive in the current world? So Lithuania started to issue special passports for the Belarusians who are in this situation, like a passport of foreigner. But it is valid only in Lithuania. So remember the situation of nonsense passports.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the solution. There was a solution. So a lot of Russians, they have this problem, of passports, of banking accounts, of visas, of travels, of job permits, schools for children, kindergartens, medical assistance. So humanitarian assistance, Russian emigres who they're not emigres who left Russia going for the better life in Europe or in the United States. For the bulk of them, it's downshifting. Their life in Europe or in Armenia and Kazakhstan is worse than it was in Moscow and in St. Petersburg or in any other Russian city, because they left everything they had. And of course they need humanitarian assistance. Any type of assistance is appreciated. But 18 months have passed and Russians have more and more and more problem. The recent resolution frequently asked questions of European Commission regarding the cars, personal cars, it's even more funny, because in the list of the goods that are not allowed are shampoos, underpants, personal computers, smartphones, and many other lists. But jewelry and gold jewelry is allowed. Can you explain this?
Yeah, when you asked this question, I thought about my own brother, who is now stuck in Georgia. He's of conscription age. Absolutely, I know that there is a program, I think called Welcome Corps here in the U.S. It was this kind of privately sponsored immigration that was last year tested on Ukrainians quite successfully, and thousands of Ukrainians managed to come here to the States. It provides them like residence permit and work authorization for, I think, 2 years. I think this year this system was also expanded to Haitians, Cubans, Venezuelans, and I hope that one day, yes, it will also be spread to Russians that are under the threat of political persecution and being mobilized.
Thank you. A question in the back.
My name is Alexander Moskalenko. I'm a lawyer from Kharkiv. Now I work for Center for Policy Analysis. So just a start remark to begin with. I was in Kharkiv when the war started, so I spent several weeks with my 4-year daughter under Russian bombings. Of course, we didn't suffer that much as Russian elite or those poor Russians who are not allowed to bring their laptops to Europe. But still, just to start with. You asked my friend, Elena, if it makes sense to study history. Yes, it does. And history teaches us that the only possible transformation from a fascist state to a normal country is the acceptance of common responsibility, common guilt, and repentance. This is what made Germany a normal country after fascism. Well, somehow I don't see any debate about accepting this common guilt, common responsibility, even among Russian opposition. That's why I have 2 questions. Question number 1, what do you think are the reasons that even Russian opposition doesn't discuss these questions, seriously at least? And number 2, correct me if I'm wrong, all of you are citizens of Russia, right? Do you feel this collective responsibility for what Russia has been doing for these decades or years in terms of Ukraine? And why? Thank you.
First, well, I said in my answer in one of the previous questions, the priority is to stop the war. And there is no doubts about this. Yeah? Our position is anti-militaristic, we're against the war, and Russian opposition in the bulk is against the war. I don't know where you're looking for the views of the Russian opposition, but the collective responsibility is a question of non-debatable. Yeah, there is a consensus about this. And I don't know where you listen here that we have not agreed, we not discuss. We know this. We know history much better than many of you. And for example, in Germany, in 1949, there was a poll, and 60% of Germans said that Nazism was a good policy. Hitler was stupid, but policy was good. So it was not so fast, and it took a generation when kids started asking their parents why this happened to our country. And it is not a question of enforcement of US policy or anything else. And about history, we are learning history, we are looking for history. My answer was that this discussion is not about history. So I'm ready to debate history with you. And I know much more about history. I'm looking on period, I'm looking at Nazism, I'm looking at Germany, on Japan, on Korea. So I know a lot of about political transformation. And I believe that Ukraine will be a prosperous European country. But Ukraine has its own homework to do. Unfortunately, there are problems in Ukraine as well. We are not discussing Ukrainian problems during the war. We understand them. And we support Ukraine by any means we can, despite we have Russian passports.
Thank you for your question. I agree with Sergei in the fact that the collective guilt is definitely here, and we all are guilty for what Russia had did to Ukraine. It's absolutely undebatable, and I agree with Sergei, because I do not know among my friends, I actually do not know many people who decline or who cannot agree with this guilt. This is the first point. The second point is about the fascism dictatorships. Look, when I was still in Russia in 2014, immediately after Russia invaded Crimea, I authored an article in Russian newspaper RBK saying that Russia develops a lot of features of fascist regime. It was the first publication in the Russian press about the fascist essence of Putin's regime. Since then, I repeated this thesis many times. But just for the sake of the historical truth, I would say that not all fascist regimes ended like Hitler regime. Because, for example, it was a case of Franco's Spain, which ended in national reconciliation and the fascist regime was overcome by restoration of monarchy and by dozens of years of collective practice. And there were different kinds of regimes, of authoritarian, quasi-fascist and fascist regimes, who were treated by ordinary transition. So therefore, in Russia's case, for good or for bad thing, it's impossible, to defeat Russia. I would like Russia to be defeated in the sense as Nazi Germany was defeated in 1945, but it seems it's impossible. So therefore, we should look on other means of, enrooting all these fascist elements of the Russian society. They are very deep. The Russian society is imperialistic. It became an empire before it became a nation state. It has no experience of a nation state. It was an empire par excellence. So therefore, it's a work for generations to change the Russian identity and Russia itself. So therefore, I agree that Ukraine should be a forerunner in this change, and it should be a first democratic and European state inside the former Russian Empire and the core of the Russian Empire. And this is your historical mission. We appreciate it, and we all are guilty before the Ukrainian people. We all share the responsibility. Don't please trust us. It's not about our passports; it's about our beliefs.
I just would like to say that I agree, so I share this opinion. Yeah.
I have nothing to add.
Oh, thank you. Unfortunately, I know there's still questions out here, but we are at time, so we're going to have to wrap up. I want to thank our excellent speakers for both the comments they prepared and their responses to these very, very questions, which were also excellent. So thank you guys for joining us this afternoon, and hope we see you again in an upcoming event.